Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Meantime, more now on the change in Labour's stance on Brexit after the party tabled an amendment to try to force the government to secure a new single market deal with the EU. Chuka Umunna is Labour MP for Streatham, chair of Leave Watch and a leading pro-European Labour Party rebel. He's in our Westminster studio. Hello to you, Mr Umunna. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. People at home watching will say, what on earth are we talking about now? What's the latest?
Well, there isn't actually been a big change. There's been a welcome change in tone, I think, but substantially the Labour Party's policy is the same, which is it seeks full access to the single market in the same way as the government. It wishes in certain respects to continue to participate in EU agencies and apply some of its standards like the government. But it is not where I and a number of other colleagues would like it to be, which is for us to stay in Europe's economic area. And why do we want that? Because on the government's own economic impact assessments, the least worst, the least damaging option short of EU membership is for us to continue part of the EEA. And secondly, this European economic area, it covers services, and of course that makes up 80% of the UK economy, whereas having a customs union, which I also want to see, covers mainly goods, which is just 20% of our economy. And then of course actually the EEA is a framework to protect your viewers' rights at work, their rights as a consumer and the environment. So that's where I'm hoping we end up when we have these votes on Tuesday in the House of Commons next week. Lots of acronyms. Are we ever going to flip in leave? Well, at the moment, we are scheduled to leave in March of 2019. Whether that happens at that time depends on where Parliament gets to with the withdrawal agreement that the Prime Minister finalises with Brussels, which is due at the end of this year. Of course, I think the thing that the government has found so challenging is that not only is this a much more protracted and drawn-out process than many of us envisaged, but also, in many respects, we were seeking to have our cake and eat it. We wanted to have all the benefits of our EU membership and the benefits that come with being part of its economic structures without being actually a member of the European Union, or certainly without the obligations and the rules that are required to be abided with. And we're finding out that that's just not possible. I mean, I suppose if it was, why would you join the club in the first place? So I don't know whether we will leave in March of 2019, but I do know that Parliament is doing its job in properly scrutinising what happens and whether or not this is a Brexit that people thought that they had been promised. Except we have to pay until the end of 2020, I think, don't we? And some suggestions that it could it's longer than that, Kay,
yeah,
actually.
So I was just about to say some suggestions longer than that. An awful lot of pressure for the Prime Minister. Yeah, so an awful lot of pressure on the Prime Minister. Do you have any sympathy for her? Do you think, some suggestions she might say, you know what, I've had enough?
Well, look, it's a challenging job to be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but I suppose if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen is what some people would say. But of course, on a human level, she's in a challenging position. I think the great shame is that she didn't learn the lesson of the general election last year. She put pursuing a very extreme break in our relationship with the European Union front and centre of the Conservative manifesto offer. That was for us to leave the customs union, leave the single market, really have very little to do with the European Union relative to where we are now. And of course, the British public rejected that, and she lost her majority in Parliament. And instead of taking note of that clear message that was given by the British people, she pursued the so-called hard Brexit regardless. And that is why I think she's kind of found it very difficult indeed. Added to which, Kay, I mean, remember all the things that we were told, that because the French want to sell us brie, the Italians Prosecco, the Germans cars, they would give us all these things and give us all these special benefits, and that hasn't turned out to be the case. Now, some might say, I can kind of hear it, some of your viewers going, yes, but they want to punish us for leaving. That is simply not the way they see it in other EU member states. They see this as damage limitation, and actually what they say is their lives would be so much easier if they knew what the UK's negotiating position is. But given that the Cabinet can agree with itself on this, it can't negotiate with itself. It's not really very competently negotiating with Europe.
Yeah, I can also hear a lot of people watching this afternoon, Mr. Amuna, saying if only there was a stronger opposition, we would potentially not have found ourselves in this position. Potentially, I suppose, a centrist party being led by somebody like David Miliband. What do you think?
Well, I think, look, we've got a first-past-the-post system with the two main parties in this country. And for them to be able to operate effectively, they've got to be broad churches and they've got to provide a clear, decisive offer. I think the problem that the Labour Party has had with our Brexit position is that too often it's been one of constructive ambiguity, whereas I think what people want to know is clearly what is Labour's position. And the further along you get with this process, the less it is possible to kind of ride two horses. You've got to be clear where you stand. And so if you're saying to the British public, look, we want the exact same benefits of the single market and the customs union, there's no logic in then saying, well, we're not going to be part of those entities. We're not going to fully participate in the customs union, the single market. And we've said, yes, we want a customs union subject to certain qualifications, but no, we don't want to be part of the European Economic Area, which enables you to participate in the single market. And that's, you know, that sounds a bit fudgy, if you like. And
Speaking of fudgy, are you fudging? Are you ignoring my question? Are you dodging it there?
No. Let me answer it directly.
Please.
I'm part of the Labour Party. The Labour Party's got a job to do. I have Labour values, and I want to see those Labour values translate through our Brexit policy. And that, for me, means staying in the EEA. So I think, you know, Labour's the show in town. The leadership issue in the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn's absolutely settled. And what we're urging him and the leadership to do is please ensure that we implement our values in the way we go about dealing with this Brexit process. And if we're going to leave, then let us do it in the least damaging way possible. And the great tragedy of this is that all the research is showing that Labour areas that voted leave in the greatest numbers stand to be hit the hardest from our departure from the European Union, which is one of the reasons I think we should have a people's vote on the Brexit deal. So the people, the 65 million people, their voices are heard in this, and it's not just determined by 650 MPs in Westminster.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Amuna. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, has issued a stark warning to the EU not to punish the UK over Brexit. He said that if Britain was harmed, Europe would be harmed too. It comes as the Prime Minister faces a showdown with some senior ministers over the government's proposals for a new customs relationship with the EU after Brexit. The row is over the official backup plan on how to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The government's latest proposals will be published tomorrow. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
Where is the plan? A question that's been asked often enough around here. There's no sign of the government's next Brexit blueprint that was promised by the end of the month. Forget detail, though. There was one plain message to the EU today from the man in charge of the process.
The Commission's position seems to be shooting itself in the foot just to prove that the gun works. So those who say or think that the UK must be seen to be damaged by Brexit should think again. Because the truth is, if you harm Britain, you harm all of Europe.
A public telling off for the European Union, but there's trouble in private too. Number 10 will tomorrow publish the temporary customs arrangement, a fix in case other solutions can't be found to the long-running problem. But there are big reservations in other parts of government about that whole proposal. As ever, the government's having a hard time agreeing with itself before persuading the rest of the EU.
Have you personally signed off all the details of the government's backstop proposal we expect to be published tomorrow? And if it comes out without your explicit approval, can you stay in your job?
That's a question, I think, for the Prime Minister, to be honest, on the second one. The detail of this is being discussed at the moment. It's been through one Cabinet Committee, it's going to another one, and it would be improper of me to preempt the negotiation.
He's not the only one who's grumpy, though. The document has no specific time limit for close ties to the EU. One source told me it's like Hotel California. We check out of the European Union, but we never leave.
What would be troubling for me and others who supported the Leave campaign is the idea of being locked into some single market type arrangement for an indefinite period.
Yet they are queuing up to tell Theresa May what to do.
The Prime Minister must lead. She must sort out the divisions in her cabinet. The British people are fed up with this.
Remain Tory rebels at Downing Street gates.
We're very supportive of the Prime Minister.
How can the Prime Minister pacify them all?
I trust I shall be able to convert her to them.
Are you bungling Brexit, Prime Minister?
Week after week, Brexit brings pressure at Prime Minister's questions.
When it comes to Brexit, this government has delivered more delays and more cancellations than Northern Rail.
The British people voted to leave the European Union, and it is this government that is delivering on the vote of the British people.
And of course, none of the shenanigans go unnoticed in the European Union.
President Juncker, have there been any new proposals from the UK on Brexit this week?
Discussing it, yes, not in the same way. Soon, David Davis and then the Prime Minister will be back in Brussels. Will the government still be finger-pointing or playing nice as friends?
Well, let's talk to Laura now. And the backup plan will be published tomorrow. Do we know what it will say?
Well, Sophie, you and viewers will know that sorting out customs arrangements after Brexit is one of the trickiest things in this negotiation, and the row over it at Westminster has been going on for many, many months now. So tomorrow we will see the black and white of what's being called the temporary customs arrangements, those arrangements that would kick in if the longer-term fixes using technology, the more ambitious ideas that the government has, can't be made to work. So it's been known as the backstop arrangement. Now, it's not the government's preferred option, we should be very clear about that, but essentially we would carry on and potentially on and on with something that's pretty much like our existing customs arrangements. We'd still have to pay attention to the rulings of the European Court, although we would in theory be able to negotiate free trade deals while in that kind of new arrangement, which obviously we can't do now. But the other thing that's a bit perplexing about all of this is, as I understand it, Number 10's getting ready to send this proposal off to Brussels tonight and then to put it out into the public domain tomorrow morning. But when we heard the Brexit Secretary there, David Davis, talk about it, he said there were still negotiations going on in Cabinet. There would be a meeting tomorrow lunchtime when it will be discussed. Now, that might all sound very technical and very processy. Why does it really matter? Well, it matters because it suggests that at the very top of government, the man who's in charge of the Brexit department has a slightly different understanding of what's going on as his next door neighbour in Number 10 Downing Street. And at a critical moment in the whole Brexit process, that certainly does matter. Unity is meant to be strength after all. And when different bits of government are saying different things, the risk is that makes them look weak.
Laura, thank you.
The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, has admitted that ministers are still, quotes, negotiating amongst themselves over how the, quotes, backstop plan to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic would actually work. The pressure is on as negotiators in Brussels are expecting to hear details of the British proposals within days. But there are even reports tonight that David Davis himself is considering resigning from the government. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary, what more do we know?
Well, it's been a rather tense day around Westminster. The Cabinet Committee that looks at Brexit, the senior ministers on that committee, had a meeting 2 weeks ago and discussed what the government would say was its position, what it would say to Brussels was its position in the event of there being no acceptance in Brussels of the technological solutions to the customs union border issues that Britain was pursuing and investigating. This proposal would mean that we would stay in pretty effectively the customs union until such time as the EU was happy with a future technological solution. Now, this morning, Cabinet Ministers got in their red boxes, some of those Cabinet Ministers who are on this committee, a text which claimed it summarised the agreed position of the ministers from that earlier meeting. David Davis has swung around and said, no, it doesn't. What he wants in that proposal is a deadline, a date, beyond which the solution, the temporary solution carrying on in the customs union would have to end. Number 10 has turned round and said, no, that's not happening. So there is a face-off behind the scenes. There's another meeting of that committee tomorrow at 12:30. Rumours, as you said, swirling around, not for the first time, I have to say, that David Davis is going to walk out of the government. It could yet be that he backs down, but my goodness, quite a sweaty night in Downing Street.
Well, Gary Gibbon, all the more reason for watching Channel 4 News tomorrow night. Krishnan.
Well, it's not just the Conservatives arguing over Brexit. Labour's shadow Brexit secretary has admitted his party is divided over whether to stay in the EU single market. Keir Starmer has ruled out measures that would see the UK remain in the European Economic Area, like Norway, and instead proposed an alternative arrangement. Labour will table amendments to the Brexit bill to make maintaining full access to the EU internal market an objective of the negotiations with Brussels. Well, with me, two Labour MPs, Caroline Flint, Europe Minister under Gordon Brown, and Alison McGovern, co-chair of the Labour campaign for the single market. Alison McGovern, what is it you think is the missed opportunity here?
Well, the Labour amendment that has been tabled describes us wanting to fully participate in all the institutions of the internal market, which is basically the single market. So I feel like if we back the Lord's EEA amendment, we get Tory rebels and we've got a chance of beating the government. And I'm just not quite sure what it is that's different about Labour's amendment. So I think the sensible thing to do, we have a pretty good position.
Well, it's because it says the single market, isn't it?
Yeah, but it describes, actually it describes all of the institutions and respecting the rules of the internal market in a way that just looks and feels and sounds like the single market. So I don't see why I'll be supporting that amendment wholeheartedly. I think we should just go one small step further, back the EA amendment, and hopefully, beat the hard-line, hard-right Tories and make sure that we protect people's jobs and rights in this country.
Caroline Flint, you want the same thing, don't you?
No, we don't. Because to be in the EA, to accept the Norway option, is to basically accept a deal that Norway had to do because it couldn't convince its own public to join the EU. So it is in the single market, and that includes accepting all the rules around freedom of movement, but also on all the other regulations that the EU sets, it has to take those regulations. It has no say. And in the referendum campaign, I'm sure Alison, like myself, when we were campaigning for Remain, we made the case that the Norway option was actually the worst option because you had to accept all the rules and have no say. What Labour is trying to do, and to be fair, what Keir is trying to do, is find some common ground across the Parliamentary Labour Party, but the red lines are that there has to be change to freedom of movement. We accept, and I accept, that we want as much access as possible to the single market, that we will pay into the European Union before we leave what we owe them, and actually in certain areas, whether it's on regulations or common institutions, we probably will take part in that too. But that is completely different from Alison's position, and she's been very clear about this, and I respect her. Alison doesn't want us to leave the EU, and she said that on countless times. And by saying we want to be in the single market and the customs unit as is, and she supports the Labour campaign for freedom of movement, she doesn't really want to leave at all.
Well, look,
Your position involves accepting freedom of movement, doesn't it? That's the problem.
I'm perfectly happy that we should reform freedom of movement, and there's many things that we could do ourselves that we haven't done. In Belgium, for example, they require people to register, and they're very proactive at getting people to leave if they haven't got a job. I'm perfectly happy to look at the way that freedom of movement operates, but my question would be about Labour's amendment. It looks like it describes all of the things that I've been talking about in terms of the single market. And it's designed to do that because it's trying to bring us together. So,
but the briefing, as you would admit, the briefing we've been given by the front bench makes it very clear that we want to be as close to the single market as possible, but not be a full member.
What does that mean?
Well, what that means, Alison, is we do not accept the rules around freedom of movement. And the problem is when you say we want to reform it, and don't forget 40% of Remain voters want to change the freedom of movement. We had that opportunity before this referendum, and both Labour and Tory governments failed.
And the fact is, we had a general election last year where Theresa May set out her version of hard Brexit, and she lost seats. She didn't gain them.
But we didn't win the election.
No, that's true. We've got a hung parliament.
And to be honest,
we've got a hung parliament.
Look, I respect honesty in this, and the honesty behind those who support the EA. And I think it's a shame because I think actually this amendment divides the Labour Party. Actually, it divides the Parliamentary Labour Party. We could have found common ground around what Keir is trying to do, and instead the EEA option, if I could say, the EEA option does not allow the sort of control over freedom of movement. And I think it's quite strange in our country that we have freedom of movement for anyone from the EU, but we have very clear restrictions on immigration for anyone else outside the EU.
Isn't the truth that Labour's official position is totally incoherent? Because you want all the benefits of the single market and the customs union, you know, while saying we're going to end freedom of movement. And there's no way that's going to happen.
I think there is a whole load of discussion across Parliament that is confusing for the public. The truth is, and I've said this, between hardline Brexiters and hardline Remainers, there's going to have to be compromise somewhere in the middle. And actually, most of the public, there's no evidence that opinions have changed. They want to feel that we can get the best deal. They recognise their compromise, but these polarised positions just aren't helping.
So you agree that the official position of the Labour Party is nonsense? It's unachievable, isn't it?
No, what I think it is, it's not perfect, I would say that. But the truth is what Keir is trying to do is set out a position. And it's interesting tonight with David Davis, because the Tories have no position whatsoever.
Caroline said before that the EEA option is the worst. That's not the worst. No deal is the worst. Crashing out of the EU without a deal is the worst. I do think it's still right for our country to be part of the European Union. And I'm not ashamed or embarrassed to say so. Because, can I just finish?
Yes, you may.
Because the way that our modern manufacturing works, we make goods across Europe, not just within our own country. Leaving the single market will be absolutely horrific for employment, especially in the north of England. And we have to accept that whilst there are things that we can do and we must do about immigration in this country, leaving the single market is such a high price to pay.
Alison,
and I simply don't think that those people who make this magical argument about we can get this great bespoke deal are being realistic about
how the EU has operated. It was a bespoke deal for Norway, a bespoke deal for Switzerland, a bespoke deal for Turkey, and there will be a bespoke deal for the United Kingdom as well.
We'll have to leave it there. I hate to butt in. That was really fascinating watching it from the middle. Thank you both very much indeed, John.
They don't sound like the most inflammatory words in British politics, but the phrase temporary customs arrangements could produce an almighty upset over Brexit amongst top ministers tomorrow. The government will finally publish details of what's known as a backstop plan. It's aimed at keeping the Irish border open until the UK and the EU agree what they're going to do on customs. What makes this backstop plan so explosive, however, is it doesn't currently have a cut-off date. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, is furious about that and is tonight considering whether to quit over it.
A Brexit Secretary of State seemingly chipper this afternoon before giving a big speech on our future outside the EU.
Secretary of State, the floor is yours.
But appearances deceive. Tonight, David Davis is considering his future, whether to quit. The reason is he's unhappy at how Downing Street, the Prime Minister, won't follow his advice on putting an end date on a scheme to reassure the EU there won't be a hard border in Northern Ireland. So is he poised to resign tomorrow?
That's a question, I think, for the Prime Minister, to be honest.
And what backstop plan will be published?
The detail of this is being discussed at the moment. It's been through one Cabinet Committee, is going to another one, and it would be improper of me to preempt the negotiation there, but I suspect it will be fairly decisive tomorrow.
The EU has demanded a backstop plan to keep the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic open. And Theresa May's version of it, to be published tomorrow, would keep the UK and the customs union and much of the single market till alternative proposals can be shown to work. Now, the Prime Minister insists the backstop would only be temporary. But what worries David Davis and other Brexiters is that she's refusing to publish a formal end date for it. So their fear is the backstop could become permanent, which would see the UK following EU rules forever. Is David Davis right to be worried that we are sending a proposal to Brussels for a backstop without an end date?
I do have sympathy with David Davis. His job is to negotiate. He needs the maximum flexibility and at the same time clarity to make that negotiation. I would expect that the government will stick to its original position, which was the backstop is a temporary backstop. It will last only a matter of months.
Now, that may be what Theresa May ultimately wants.
Are you bungling Brexit, Prime Minister?
But tonight, Downing Street was saying there'd be no such end date promise in what's put out tomorrow, so another headache for her after a day of Brexit headaches.
When it comes to Brexit, this government has delivered more delays and more cancellations than Northern Rail. The government's white paper is delayed, its customs proposals have been cancelled and it's ripped up its own timetable.
Labour voted for a referendum. They voted to trigger Article 50. And since then, they have tried to frustrate the Brexit process at every stage. The British people voted to leave the European Union, and it is this government that is delivering on the vote of the British people.
So these are some of the Tory rebels who next Tuesday are set to vote against May's version of Brexit. Yes, it's a government promising to supposedly liberate us from the EU, but which cannot escape constant Brexit crisis.
And Robert joins me in the studio now. Robert, I mean, David Davis has threatened to resign before, but do you think things may be different this time over this issue?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, let's be clear, this time it is serious for a couple of reasons. One is relations between David Davis on the one hand, Downing Street, Theresa May on the other, have been deteriorating for some time. They've been losing confidence in him. He's been increasingly fed up that he's felt marginalised, that they've been calling the shots on Brexit, despite the fact he's got the Brexit title. Now, the reason he is particularly incensed that she wants tomorrow to publish this backstop plan without an end date in the plan is he thinks that will desperately undermine his ability to negotiate, because once the EU has the backstop, basically Britain staying in the customs union and partly in the single market, he believes they will have absolutely no incentive to take seriously the other proposals the government wants, this so-called Max Fact proposal or this new customs partnership proposal, which are alternatives to staying in the customs union and would see the UK breaking free of EU rules to a much greater extent. Tonight, he is talking to his closest allies. Those who advise him say, frankly, it is 50-50 whether he goes. I have to say, my sources tell me that it's not definite, but if he were to go, this would be the most serious resignation she's faced, because Brexit is absolutely at the heart of everything this government does, and to lose the person in charge at this juncture would be very damaging. Big question whether she would survive it.
So it's a fundamental moment for her. Thank you very much indeed, Robert.
Westminster is tonight in a febrile state. In the lobbies, the talk is of backstops, amendments and possible resignations over Brexit. What does all that mean? Essentially that the Prime Minister has still not managed to rally her cabinet around a unified position. And yes, we've heard it before, that something or someone will have to give soon. At Times today, there were predictions of the imminent resignation of David Davis, the Brexit Secretary. Well, he hasn't gone, not yet anyway. What does the rest of the EU think of all this? We'll come to that in a moment. But first, our political editor, Nick Watt, is here to decode the day's events. What actually has been happening, Nick?
Well, we have a very public cabinet showdown on Brexit, and David Davis is very happy for us to be speculating that he may resign if he doesn't get his way on the so-called backstop for Northern Ireland. Now, what this row centres on is whether you should have a specific end date for when that backstop, which is designed to avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland, in which the UK would remain in some but not all of the customs union. He says there absolutely has to be an end date. Theresa May says it should be time limited, but you should not have a specific end date. And friends of David Davis are saying that he's rather enjoying his role at the moment as a political terrorist by keeping the Prime Minister guessing. So this afternoon, our colleague Laura Kuenssberg asked David Davis, had he signed off on the backstop, and if he's not happy, would he resign?
That's a question, I think, for the Prime Minister, to be honest, on the second one. The detail of this is being discussed at the moment. It's been through one Cabinet Committee, it's going to another one, and it would be improper of me to preempt the negotiation.
Will this actually happen, though, do you think?
Well, that answer to Laura Kuenssberg on the resignation was deliberately designed by David Davis to not deny that there's a threat out there to resign, because he believes that's a weapon. If you deny it, then it's no longer a weapon. Now, he does have very, very deep concerns. He believes that if there is no end date to the backstop, then the European Union would have no incentive to negotiate with the UK on a future trade deal. And if that happens, then he doesn't really have much of a mandate as the Brexit secretary. But I was speaking to one leading Brexiteer tonight who used to sit in the cabinet, who's saying, I hope David Davis goes. I hope he brings the House down, but I'm not holding my breath.
And briefly, what's their position on this end stop point?
Well, the EU are very encouraged by what they see as the most serious engagement from the UK in months, but they have two big problems. One is the substance of the backstop. They say half in, half out of the customs union. Real problem there. And the other problem is if it's temporary, what comes next?
Extraordinary goings on.